I was just a boy. Everybody told me what I should do, who I should be. Stand back.
Welcome to episode 2 of the Mr. McMahon Netflix documentary review. I'm so excited to get into this. What we did get is a sponsorship from Game Up Hard Hydration. It's like your favorite seltzer, your favorite sports drink got together, but it's so much better. They have been our sponsors for 2024. We talk about them all the time. We have fun with these ads, but we genuinely enjoy this product. Dave, tell them about those great flavors.
Oh, fruit punch, orange, lemon lime, and grape, guys. Comes in an 8-pack. It's only 110 calories per can. It's low carb. Enjoy yourself some Game Up and enjoy.
We are starting to talk about episode 2 of the Mr. McMahon documentary. And as Dave sang at the top, this episode started with Stand Back. What did you think about that, Dave?
Oh, man. I remember watching this when I was a kid and seeing his Slammy Awards. And you're a kid, so forgive me. My train of thought is a little weird. But this is what I remember thinking. Is this guy trying to be James Brown? Which is like he was not James Brown. But that's what I thought when I was a kid.
I love that your mind went there because as a kid, I looked at this video and I thought having all those wrestlers playing the instruments on stage meant they were the center of attention. I'm like, look, there's Hogan, there's George Animal Steel, Jake the Snake plays saxophone. And then watching it as an adult, I thought, is this guy trying to be James Brown? Now, I didn't think that exactly, but I thought, oh, this was a vehicle for Mr. McMahon to be the star. And it's funny because it's such an old school 80s memory, but watching it now, it's almost like the picture starts to change a little bit. And when you listen to those lyrics and you hear that Mr. McMahon voice come out where he talks about stomping other people into the ground, this was a wild way to start.
Yeah, I was going to sing some more Stand Back, but I think instead we'll just move on. How about that?
Oh, yeah. So they start talking about how in the 80s, wrestling had that kind of mainstream approach coming off of WrestleMania. And then going into Saturday night's main event, the first time WWF hit NBC, it was an interesting idea because there were a couple times a year where Saturday Night Live didn't go live. So NBC, as a replacement, found Saturday night's main event. And this was just further putting WWF in the center of pop culture.
Saturday night's main event was a very cool thing growing up as a kid to watch. I love Saturday. It's interesting to know they were every few months because as a kid, it felt like they took forever. And I remember being so excited when I'd hear about them being on. And sometimes I didn't even know they were going to be on. You just stumble up, your parents were up late and you got to stay up late and they're like, hey, Dave, look at this. And I'm like, oh, and it makes me excited now for Saturday night's main event because they're coming back. We're going to get Saturday night's main event soon in December. And so seeing these old videos of Saturday night's main event just brought back a lot of good memories. And also now watching this as an adult, you realize like, wow, that must have been so huge at that time in pro wrestling to get a show like that on NBC.
Yeah, definitely. I think we hear Bruce Pritchard comment about it during the show. So far in this documentary series, we've covered the rise of McMahon and the rise of WWE, the rise of WrestleMania, and the first kind of negative note that gets brought up of anything is the next thing covered, and that is the wrestling schedule. Now, in this documentary, they make it sound like it was all day, every week of the year. And the old schedule was very close to that. What was that Evan Ginsberg movie that he had produced? Was that like 352 days?
Yeah, something like that. It was most of the year.
And a lot's been made. Yeah, there was, they worked a lot of the year, way busier than the schedule is. Did you happen to catch the wrestler that was no longer with the WWE, but in this documentary during this little montage?
No, I don't know if I did. Who was it?
Odyssey Jones. They were talking about the wrestling schedule, saying how the schedule isn't as bad anymore. And then they showed Odyssey Jones, which I just thought was interesting because you think about this documentary being produced years ago. We only saw Odyssey Jones recently, and he's already gone. So it's just kind of the funny way of how footage is sometimes, where the documentary can be shot at one time, not come out for years. Happens the same thing in video games. People are in a video game, not with the company when the video game comes out. And moving on from that wrestling schedule, they talk about the Jesse Ventura union issue.
It was interesting because they're talking about this as they're heading into WrestleMania 2. And I thought Jesse, it's just interesting to watch because Hogan talks about how, Jesse wanted to get a union and he was pro Vince. So he went and told Vince right away what was happening. But Hogan had denied that over the years. But here he really admitted it. And Bret Hart talks about it too. Bret Hart said we could have used the union. And he said Hogan basically ratted out Ventura to Vince. So we never got it going. And Dave Meltzer talked about this too, that he says it's probably less likely they're going to get a union now.
Yeah, and even Vince said that the guys wouldn't have rallied behind Jesse, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, they didn't really feel that confident. That's always been the thing, was that wrestlers would probably always try to undercut each other. Some guys would say, oh, yeah, I got your back. And then they'd go behind and say, hey, Vince, this guy's not going to make it. The wrestlers just couldn't trust each other.
Yeah, the wild nature of wrestling at that time. And you could argue even currently. Now, they did talk about that going into WrestleMania 2. Did you think they even needed to include WrestleMania 2 in this documentary? Or was it only to kind of, bridge that union issue?
Yeah, I don't know. It was kind of glossed over. I didn't have a problem with it. But, I think if you're going in a kind of chronological order, it is interesting that WrestleMania 2, when you think about it, although I guess didn't really work for them, it was quite the undertaking. I mean, doing 3 different cities for one big live show and 3 different feeds. They've never attempted that again. I almost kind of wonder, be kind of interested to see if they did attempt something like that again, because it's just not something that's really that practical. But it's interesting. It's an interesting part of history to go watch. That's for sure. Did it need to be in there? I think you should at least gloss over it.
You got to feel like the technology would be closer to there for it now. But I mean, it was the first real time we had seen McMahon falter publicly. And that was turned right around with WrestleMania 3, which is covered in detail. Hogan acting nervous because he didn't know if Andre would work with him. What did you think of that set of stories about this?
Hogan being Hogan, I think Vince almost kind of collaborated with it too a little bit, which is interesting. But I believe Andre might have been busting his balls, I can see that, but they had to know what was about to happen and they had an idea what they were doing. I don't believe Hogan was I don't seriously doubt Hogan won this match feeling not confident that Andre wasn't going to do the honors. I think it's just embellishing a story a little bit. What I liked a little bit before this, though, was Vince talked about Andre was doing the Princess Bride and he was going to just kind of, cash out all his chips. And Vince talked about him having a surgery and, doing 93,000, and Andre just laughs, ho, ho, ho. And, he agrees to have the surgery when he sees that him and Hogan, when Andre has the heel. But I thought it was interesting because I just rewatched the Andre the Giant documentary on HBO Max, where it was done a few years earlier, and they talked about him on The Princess Bride and how hurt he was, and he couldn't even hold up the lady in that movie. They had wires kind of propelling her and stuff like that because he was in so much pain at that time and he didn't have the strength in his arm. So it's interesting that Andre would have probably had to have surgery. And that's one thing. I knew Andre's back was bad, but I didn't realize he had surgery already going into WrestleMania 3.
And I believe that's where it was wrong. See, I had heard he had the surgery after WrestleMania 3 because at WrestleMania 3, he was wearing a back brace. And apparently that's why they went with the one strap singlet that he was wearing. I forget. I think I heard that on Post. It might have been on Eric Bischoff. So that was one thing where it seems like the timelines might have got a little twisted in Vince's head. And when you talk about WrestleMania 3, you can't talk about it without the attendance controversy, which interesting take if you don't know. But I mean, it's kind of like the Montreal screw job where it's one of those things that we've heard for a while.
Yeah. And I think this is where a guy like Dave Meltzer really shined, where he was there talking about how it was 78,000 and people he would talk to. And, Dave gets a bad rap these days too for sometimes falsely reporting certain things. But Dave Meltzer, the historian, is really great in a piece like this to kind of help keep balance for everything you're hearing.
Yeah, because that's the tough point with the wrestling documentary is how much are you going to get of the real story? Wrestling itself is a business that's all about projecting an image, kind of hiding the truth at times. So it really helps to have that fact checker. And you're going to need that fact checker when you get to talking about the cinematic masterpiece that was no holds barred. When I was a kid, I thought this movie was the coolest thing. You know, it wasn't Rocky 3, but it was amazing. And the older I get, the more ridiculous it is. I got to go back and watch it sometime soon because I wonder what I would think of it now.
I've only got one thing to say about this movie, and we're going to move on. Dookie.
So the one story that's wild in this, and they try and purport that Vince and Hulk had come up with this script after getting together in a hotel room for 2 days to write the movie. Now, the way that I had heard it, and once again, I think this was from Post, was that a script had been brought to them. They liked parts of it. They didn't like it totally, but that they did decide to rewrite it. So I don't know if there's solo writing credits on it there, but it's a wrestling movie. So, you know, what can you really say? And it was interesting to talk about this movie that came from the height of Hulkamania to talk about Hulkamania fading at WrestleMania 6 and then kind of glossing over the Ultimate Warrior.
We completely skipped over WrestleMania 4 and 5, which is fine. It is an interesting time. Hogan fading his popularity around this time, I would say that's pretty about right. I remember when he was wrestling the Warrior as a kid, I thought, oh, is Warrior going to be a heel? Is Warrior going to be a bad guy now? Because, you know, Hogan's always the good guy. But then they had like a good guy versus good guy match, and Warrior won straight. And as a kid, I kind of started to get it as I was getting a little older. I'm like, oh, this guy's going to be like taking over Hogan's role now. Warrior's going to be that. And as a kid, I remember I was kind of excited because I wanted something fresh. And I was kind of done with Hulk Hogan. So for me, this timeline made sense. As we all know, Warrior wasn't really going to be the guy, unfortunately, because of a lot of stuff that happened in and out of the ring. He just didn't have really the attitude for it. But I would say WrestleMania 6 to WrestleMania 7, it was definitely, I was done with Hulk Hogan.
Yeah, because they talk about it how, you know, they don't talk a lot about how the Ultimate Warrior story, because that would have been an interesting piece of McMahon's life, given the problems that McMahon and Warrior had between each other, but that the Warrior kind of viewed them as family. And when they weren't able to go with Warrior, they go back to Hogan. You've got him up against Sergeant Slaughter, the whole Iraq issue. Another in the 80s, it seemed like it was almost one scandal after another for Vince when they happened. And Iraq was one that they kind of sidestepped, but they definitely took a little bit of a beating on.
Yeah, they leaned into it at the time, you know, with the problems in the Middle East before the war had actually started and we sent troops there. I actually was at a TV taping as a kid in Providence, Rhode Island, where a heel Sergeant Slaughter came out and had basically ran down America and talked about the thing going on in Kuwait at the time when it was just in Kuwait. And this was the very beginning of that, you know, before you had General Adnan and everything. So, yeah, looking back at it, it's like, man, like, what were you thinking? Like, you know, like you should have pulled the plug on this a lot sooner. And Sergeant Slaughter, like, who I respect as a wrestler and a performer, and he's given us a lot of great memories, and who was clearly fearless because he embraced that role. But this was a guy really past his prime. Like, you know, I mean, if it wasn't for this like gimmick as this guy, the Iraqi sympathizer, like this really isn't a match you would want to see, Hogan versus Slaughter in this time period.
No, I think what made it really wild was just seeing this American hero who had been a G.I. Joe character become part of the enemy. And there was even talk about one time burning an American flag on WWF TV. I think they settled with burning the Hogan picture. They definitely ripped the Iraqi flag, which, you know, I guess you could see it, but it's like, if you're going to make one flag sacred, is it okay to desecrate another? It was just a wild idea. It was kind of like a sign of the times around then, and just the first of many scandals that hit them.
Yeah, for sure. That definitely a sign of the time period. Also interesting to note at WrestleMania 7, you do see celebrities in the crowd. A young Macaulay Culkin, fresh off of Home Alone, and a younger, well, not younger than Macaulay, but a younger Donald Trump is also in the audience here too.
Yeah, this was a time, what was it, 3 and 4 were held at Trump Plaza in New York or in New Jersey. You know, that's where that Trump connection really kind of first came in. And another connection leading to another major controversy is Dr. George Sahorian. You know, if you know wrestling, you know the role of steroids, you know the name Sahorian. You were kind of interested to see that he had made appearances on WWF TV, I believe.
Yeah, we talked about this when we were both watching this documentary the first time, and it was interesting. I had forgotten that he was the doctor at ringside. You know, this is during that Bob Backlund era, probably, and you would see him out there. I think you even see Bob Backlund in one of the videos, one of the clips they're showing of Azorian. They're looking at some guy, and it was interesting to know too when I was just looking him up because I was just curious that he still had a practice to this day.
Yeah, that's wild, especially given the controversy. And, you know, like from what I've heard of Zahorian, he was definitely a fan of wrestling, probably kind of what led to the easy access with the guys or being so willing to facilitate them with things. You know, there was a time where steroids were legal. And he was, you know, the ringside physician in the early 80s when they'd announce the announcer, the refs, the ringside physician. You would hear his name a lot. And then, you know, it got to something darker. And then eventually, you know, the whole steroid trials happen. You get Vince in the neck brace. That was another great throwback.
Yeah,
and kind of
Vince even admits too. Around this time, they started the WBF, the World Bodybuilding Federation, and he said, "Boy, the timing of that was bad. They knew they had to end that, you know, because that's all bodybuilders were doing was taking steroids."
Well, that's what I was laughing at when he makes it sound like it was just a bad time to form the WBF, because it wasn't a great time, but also I don't know how big a bodybuilding league would need to be. And there were the established Weeder brothers who were big in that bodybuilding arena. So this was, you know, an example of Vince going outside of wrestling to promote something and it failing. And that's why if you go back to the first episode, if they had talked about that Cape Cod arena he owned and talked maybe a little bit about the Evel Knievel jump, you could have previewed things there. But again, a 6-hour documentary, you can only fit so much in. Now, Dave, were you familiar with Phil Mushnick before this interview or this documentary?
Yes. I was going to talk about this on another show we're about to do, but the first time I heard the name Phil Mushnick was when Jim Cornette actually talked about him on Monday Night Raw. This is when Jim would come out and do his little editorials that didn't represent WWE necessarily, and he'd blast people, and WWE would give Cornette that format. And Cornette had brought up Phil Mushnick talking about basically that he didn't like him and that I think he was upset that he thought Mushnick was exploiting the death of Brian Pillman and how Pillman was a friend of his. And so that was the first time I really became familiar with Phil Mushnick.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting to see him and hear from him in this documentary, because if you hear from it from the wrestling side, from Vince's side, it sounds like this reporter is trying to take them down, like he's trying to target wrestling, when in reality, he's just covering some of the wildest stories he's come across, and they just happen to coincide with pro wrestling. Get into the first one, the Jimmy Snuka controversy. They talk about Jimmy Snuka's girlfriend dying and how it seemed to get kind of swept under the rug. My favorite part of this is the clip where you see Jimmy Snuka looking at the camera doing a promo saying, "Hell, it's gonna be hot." And then Vince looks over at him and goes, "Indeed." And now it's wild that when you think back on that, like, ooh, how that almost gave me chills that it was, you know, so ironic that they'd have that in there.
I guess you're probably going to resonate, but this is when we first, around the time they started talking about the Rita
Chatterton. Yeah. See, they go from Jimmy Snuka, and I'm not going to say they breeze through it, but they go quickly over Jimmy Snuka. They talk about the Ring Boy scandal. And I think this is one of the first places that I really had a problem with Vince talking about Phil Mushnick, you know, coming at them, because he's reporting about these child abuse things. Yeah. Vince is acting like they're just getting targeted. And then you got Phil Mushnick. It was a pedophile ring. Yeah. And it's wild when, because Between the Sheets Patreon, they did a great series on the Ring Boy scandals called Titangate. And they get into this a lot. And it's just wild because, like, one thing, Mel Phillips was fired by Vince and then rehired back not too long later and just told to stay away from the kids. Can you imagine knowing that somebody's a pedophile and just being like, "Steer clear of the kids' table, Terry"? You know, like it's kind of one of those wild things, but it's wrestling. There was kind of this culture of, things going around, because this the episode where we got our favorite quote here.
Yes, because
Tony
several
Atlas?
people were found guilty, and one of them who wasn't was found as it was Pat Patterson, and Pat left. And they hired back Pat, and you had Bruce Pritchard talking about Pat, how he was openly gay and a homophobic business, but Pat had never done anything wrong, best of my knowledge. And then we go to Tony Atlas. I didn't really like Pat. He grabbed my pecker in the shower all the time, in which the person on Netflix interviewing him said, he did what? Grab my pecker. And so that was definitely one of the highlights for me, was just Tony Atlas and Tony's raw honesty that comes out here a few times, but this was definitely the first instance of Tony Atlas just saying what was on his mind. And then, of course, them asking him, well, why didn't you complain about it? And Tony's like, complain to who? He was the booker. And then they asked him, complain to Vince. He's like, Vince. He's like, you don't know the wrestling business, son. He's like, I'd be out of a job. He needs Pat more than he needs me. Again, just that raw honesty from Tony Atlas.
Yeah, and I was listening to an interview with, I believe it was one of the Eric Bischoff watch-alongs, where it was either Pat LaPrade or Bertrand, somebody else. They did the Pat Patterson book, and they talked about Pat's style of sense of humor as a gay man was to make straight men uncomfortable. And sometimes things like, grabbing somebody's pecker, using Tony Atlas's words, would be considered a rib. That's where there's a real gray point, because it's like Mel Phillips, Terry Garvin definitely did things wrong. Pat Patterson obviously was a little more protected, but, wanted to get away from things to not bring attention to the WWF. And I think they could have explored that a little more, but that's the thing. When you breeze through these subjects, you give a quick bite of the story. And overall, I don't know. I wasn't there, so I can't say what Pat did. I'm sure it rode the 2024 eyes and sensibilities.
Oh, for sure. For sure. It was interesting, too, because there's another thing, too, like with the Rita Chatterton thing. Again, all this was happening at the same time in a documentary, which is crazy to think all of this was happening around the same time. But the thing with the Rita Chatterton
Rita Chatterton follows the Ring Boy thing.
And the thing that was interesting about that, when you talk about the Ring Boys, and then this is going on, and the steroid trial is about to take place. But like with Rita Chatterton, like I go back to that because of Phil Mushnick, where he talked about, covering this stuff, and like this story should have resonated with people, but it just didn't. And you can see her talking about on Geraldo Rivera about how, her case where Vince tried to force oral sex on her and then bring her on top, and said, if I wanted a $500,000 a year contract, I would have to please his needs. And then you had male audiences like, Rita, what are you looking to get out of this? And you can see that the times that people were not very sensitive. And I want to point out Bret Hart here, because Bret Hart talked about this afterwards when Janelle Grant stuff came out, and said that he did not believe Rita at the time, and he's embarrassed and apologizes about that and wants nothing to do with Vince ever again. And he's met Rita at some of the signings and stuff throughout the years, and he says he's since apologized to her and said he was sorry, and he believes her. And I thought it'd be real interesting if we could have interviewed Bret for this documentary after that stuff happened.
I know that would have been interesting. Now, how familiar are you with the Rita Chatterton story? Do you know it any more than it's covered in this documentary?
Can't say for sure that I do.
All right, so there's one detail about the whole Rita Chatterton thing that I'm surprised they didn't include it in the documentary, and this is almost why it doesn't feel like a hit piece. So while that whole thing's going on, when Vince is talking to her, because they went to dinner somewhere, she kept trying to talk to him about this advancement she's trying to get with the company. He doesn't want to do it around everybody, so he tells her to meet him somewhere else. That's how they end up at the limo, because they went to a different restaurant, got into the limo. She gets in, limo driver leaves. And this is when, he talks to her about not being involved with anyone in the wrestling business, and saying how I can't remember if it was like a fireable offense or if it was something that wasn't good. And then after, Vince forces himself on her, he goes, well, you were just involved with somebody in the business. So it's almost like he got what he wanted out of it, and then told her, well, look, you're violating the rules there, so you can't. I'm basically paraphrasing the story, but basically Vince put her in an unwinnable position, because it's like, you're going to do what I want. oh, by doing what I want, you kind of nullified the terms of the contract, so you're out. And it was wild because this is in the documentary where he mentions, well, if it was rape, the statute of limitations was up. And then during the filming of this, there was the caption that the statute was lifted and he settled with her for millions of dollars. So it's a story that I feel like they could have gotten a little more into. And that detail might have made it feel like a gotcha piece. But this is another thing where they cover it, but I feel like they go kind of easy on Vince a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, there's stuff that gets left out and who knows, but yeah, Vince with that line about the statute of limitations when it ran out was just horrible. He came off sounding so bad here.
And it's one of those wild things where Vince doesn't want to give you a lot about himself, but you get insights into Vince, a comment like that where it's a response to something and he doesn't even know he's giving you anything, but you get gold in that moment. You go from Rita Chatterton to talking about Hulk, his star kind of fading and deciding to leave the WWF and how he wouldn't compete against Vince. And they're really building this up because Hogan says he knows in his head what he's going to say as he's going in. He hadn't seen Vince in a while. What did you think of ending the note of this episode on the steroid trials?
It was a nice cliffhanger. One other thing, too, I just want to backtrack to, which I thought was interesting watching this the second time, was when Vince talked about, and Hogan even admitted it, that he agreed not to compete, and then he went on to sign with WWE compete. It was Shane McMahon basically says that's still taboo with me even to this day. And I thought that was very interesting, with Shane McMahon was basically saying he was not a fan of Hulk Hogan even to this day, is the way I took that. Yeah, it was interesting. It was an interesting cliffhanger, though, ended with Hogan basically saying, he took the plea and then knew exactly what he was going to say. And that's how they ended the documentary, with that cliffhanger. Again, I already know what happens, but yeah, I thought that was an interesting way to kind of end it.
Yeah, and episode 2, very good episode. It's, it kind of gives you a little primer course on all the big scandals that happened to WWF over the years. And 2 episodes in, very much enjoying it. The biggest thing I like out of these episodes is the footage. They could go a little deeper, but I'm still entertained. I've watched them multiple times and it doesn't get old.
Yeah, I would just concur with that. And for me, it's the footage. And then some of the quotes we get to, like, I don't think I remember Jimmy Hart saying, I'm just trying to think. I don't know what they want me to say. There's a real raw honesty at times from some of the people they gathered. Like I said, Shane McMahon saying that's still taboo with me to this day. Tony Atlas, clearly very honest. So between the sound bites and the quotes of some of the people they got for interviewed and that raw old footage, that's definitely the stuff I enjoyed the most here.
Yeah, because the way Jimmy Hart was, it was funny. It was like, you didn't know who was dating who or what was going on. And then when they ask him to elaborate, that's when he stops and he's like, oh, I don't really know what they want me to say. And, I like Jimmy Hart, but in a way that just kind of makes me look at him different, because I don't want to say it makes me look at him less favorably, but when you're here for a documentary, you know what the purpose is. Maybe Jimmy Hart is really good for like a WWF documentary, just talking about the business, but it would be interesting to hear the behind the scenes stories from Jimmy Hart. Think about him. He's seen Memphis. He's seen peak WWF. He's seen WCW. He's seen the indies after WCW. And that's years of stories, but he is just such a member of the wrestling business that I don't think you're ever going to hear those things. And maybe it's why Hogan enjoys having him in the fold so much.
Absolutely. He's a model employee for whoever he works for. You can trust him. He's a loyal soldier. He's just going to keep his nose clean, do his job. And if he doesn't like it, he's just going to get out. And there's going to be no controversy, and he's not going to be one to talk about anything. Not great 100%. On a documentary.
And I'll tell you who we love having in the fold, who we are loyal soldiers for. That's the 4 great flavors of Game Up Hard Hydration.
If you haven't tried Game Up, then you are missing out. Imagine your favorite seltzer and your favorite sports drink had a baby, but it's way better than that. Each can is 110 calories, low carb, 4.9 ABV. It's a nice light drink that is not light on flavor. Game Up comes in fruit punch, orange, lemon, lime, and grape. Pick it up at drinkgameup.com or at your nearest liquor store.
Hey fans, it's the man they call Dave with producer Joe. And you probably know us as the commentary team for New Heights Pro Wrestling, but But when we're not doing that, we got a podcast.
That is the Working Fans Podcast, where we talk pro wrestling, comedy, MMA, and so much more.
And tell them about that signature segment.
Oh, you talk about the 531?
You know I am.
That is a homegrown creation that has been our namesake. And if you want to know our namesake, we got Chevy, AJ Strange Brew, as well as the two of us.
And why don't you go to our channel, like, subscribe, show us some love.
Rate, review, all of it.
Read about the Northern Wrestling Federation in the book presented by Russellville.com, The Pro Wrestling Vault, Volume 2. Hear the story of Roger Ruffin, the man who trained Carl Anderson, the Monster Abyss, Jordan Clearwater, Chris Harris, and Jillian Hall.
Plus 45 other short stories including Jazz, Bobby Eaton, Kamala, Thunder Rosa, Mario Mancini, Scott Casey, PJ Black, Kerry Morton, Sal Renaro, Jeremiah Plunkett, Colby Carino, Bam Bam Malone, and many others.
Get your book today at Russellville.com. Russellville. It's where wrestling lives.